UK races to expand booster rollout amid Omicron fears. Just a short video today, but I'm finding this current situation to be somewhat surreal and I just wanted to reflect on it briefly. As usual, I'm going to put my caveat up front and centre. This is a discussion of the current situation, seeking to make sense of public policy decisions. Nothing in any of my videos is ever intended as medical advice. I do not seek to influence your choices about whether to get a medical treatment or not, and I have no claims to any expertise in this area. Do not get your medical advice from YouTubers and certainly not from this one. Alright, now we got that out of the way. So as we all know, only too well by now, we have news of a new variant called Omicron. And we know that it's significantly mutated, and that might mean a bunch of stuff, but we have no evidence as to exactly what. That is certainly enough to label it as a development of interest and concern, and something that needs to be looked very carefully at. I mean, seriously, it could turn out really badly. Nevertheless, we have a well-vaccinated population, we have antiviral drugs coming online, we know that COVID is going to be endemic, so it makes no sense that our response every time there's a new variant is going to be to throw everything up into the air and start imposing restrictions that cause real harm to real people. Because what do you expect to change between now and the time when you don't do that anymore? And if nothing, then does that mean you expect to throw everything up in the air every time there's a new variant? Like what, every 6 months maybe? We've already seen what happens when you normalise. In the UK, we've had hospitalisation and death rates in the last few months that were as high as some of those we saw in 2020. The difference is that we stopped worrying about them. We stopped obsessing over daily death counts. We added them to all of the other causes of death that are part of life and simply stopped referring our lives to them at every opportunity. And that was rational because we have vaccines, we have treatments coming online. So the worry that this would suddenly grow exponentially and push the health service to ruin, those no longer apply. And for all the lockdown zealots will argue that every death counts, and of course it does, everyone is a tragedy, but that's not how societies routinely behave, and they couldn't function if they did. But the puzzling thing is why this has been feeding through into a new obsession with booster shots. Now, don't get me wrong, what we know about vaccine efficacy, booster shots in the UK make perfect sense for the over 65s and those who are over 50 who have comorbidities or other weaknesses. But suddenly we're being told that because of the Omicron variant, we have to speed up the boosters and expand them to other age groups and even reduce the time from your previous vaccination from 6 months to 3 months before you get one. That doesn't intuitively make a lot of sense. Right now, we don't know how much Omicron does or doesn't evade the effects of the vaccines. We know that given the nature of the mRNA technology, we'd be able to get refashioned vaccines to plug the gap within 2 to 3 months, which is amazing. But we don't know how effective these existing booster shots will be against Omicron. I'm guessing we'll know that in a couple of weeks or so, from what I've heard. So why wouldn't you wait? Right now, at the time of shooting this video, there is no evidence that Omicron can outcompete the Delta variant to become a major or dominant variant. There's no evidence that if it does, it makes illness and death more likely. So far, there have been no reported hospitalisations or deaths with it, although it is early days, come on, and those early cases have often been of younger people. But it could be that it's a blessing. The ideal would be that it is more transmissible and significantly reduced harm. That outcome is compatible so far with the current evidence. It is very early days, and I'm aware of my own bias here, because I would really wish for that to be the case. We shouldn't allow our assessments of risk to become biased by wishful thinking. I'm trying not to let that influence my response to how governments are taking action on all of this. But it still doesn't make much sense to me. However much I try to account for my biases, the priority for vaccination seemed to me to be to give booster shots to the old and the vulnerable, and then distribute as many as possible to actually vaccinate people in poorer countries for the first time where they can't get their first shots. And then if we get evidence that Omicron does strongly diminish the effects of vaccination, and we get evidence that it is likely to cause severe illness and death, Then you ask the question, is it better that we now rushed ahead with a diminished effectiveness booster? And the answer might be yes. Or is it better to push through the revised vaccine that will be produced in the face of Omicron, which will provide much more effective protection against that variant? Now, probably it's either one or the other, not both, I would have thought. Now, look, there is an argument against depending on an adapted vaccine and sticking to the original, and it goes like this. Vaccines that are based on the original Wuhan variant of the virus are then based on genetic code that is likely to be mostly present in all variants, so it should give you a good degree of protection from whatever comes along. But if you create a vaccine specifically for one variant, then you risk being harder hit when a new variant springs up from the other side of the family tree. And that does make sense as an argument for those that might be vulnerable to get a booster with the existing vaccines. It still doesn't make sense as to why you suddenly need to boost within 3 months of getting your second shot for younger, healthy people with no comorbidities. The vaccines lose efficacy over time, but not within 3 months. I mean, it does seem like a panic measure. I will happily listen to any scientist who can explain in rational language why a 3-month booster for a 40-year-old healthy person is suddenly needed. I do understand that it would reduce cases slightly, but amongst a population that wouldn't expect to see severe illness because they're young and they are vaccinated, is it really a priority? Can't just be based on a marginal improvement. The Times' science editor Tom Whipple asked the question whether we were all overreacting about Omicron, recognising that the threat is real. And he said this, it is still perfectly plausible that when the data arrives we might discover the world has indeed overreacted and happily merely ended up looking a bit silly. That rather ignores that there are real world costs to that overreaction. Apparently half of booked Christmas parties have all now been cancelled, hitting a desperately weakened hospitality industry at its most important time of the year. The travel bans and added restrictions are likewise devastating to that industry and destroying the plans of hundreds of thousands of people, throwing their travel into chaos yet again. And there are all sorts of ripple effects. This is not the sort of thing we should be doing every time there's just a question mark. This is really the consequences of all the politics and the attacks that came from the early stages of the pandemic, when numerous governments, the UK amongst them, were held to have acted too slowly, and they don't want to be vulnerable to the same charge again. But it's maddening that they're not accounting for the other costs. So, for instance, up to 740,000 cancer tests have been dropped since the first lockdown, according to a report this week. A lot of that would have happened with or without lockdown, as people kept away from hospitals for fear of catching COVID. But even so, the point is we should be looking at optimum health outcomes for the largest number of people, not just focusing on this one variable again. If South Africa right now is in the grip of a scourge of Omicron, with people dying in greater numbers, then maybe, just maybe, that would be appropriate. So far, all we've heard is that all the cases have been mild. Cases have been increasing in South Africa, some people have died, but none of those deaths so far have been tied to Omicron. Both Delta and Omicron are at work in South Africa. It was reported today that the WHO is increasingly convinced that the new Omicron variant is super mild, and it called for countries to drop travel restrictions and end mass hysteria. So, if it turned out to be the worst case scenario, Omicron outcompetes Delta and has significantly greater ability to dodge the vaccines, would that justify the current public policy measures and panic? Well, maybe if a degree of vaccine avoidance was high, and if the lethality of the virus was also high, so that you could envisage exponential curves similar to the first wave of the pandemic in terms of hospitalizations and deaths. And to be fair, we've only contemplated that because we can see that this virus has so significantly mutated from the other strains, we can see the potential as to why it might be a real game changer. But the problem is that you can't keep locking up society. We've burned through all of our reserves. We've used up most of the population's goodwill, and we have killed a lot of small businesses and are pushing a lot more to the brink. We have supply chain crises partly because of a pandemic. We have an energy crisis partly because of it as well. The cost of taking those measures again would be twice as bad or more. than they were the first time round. You better make sure they're needed. If I felt that our political leadership had shown competence at key points over the last couple of years, I might be more willing to give benefit of the doubt, I expect. Don't really have that confidence. They have lurched from underreaction to overreaction on a regular basis. I thought they'd finally got to the right place after the last few months, but now here we are, lurching once again. Now we have a situation where you have ridiculous things like you must mask up to buy alcohol in a supermarket. You can then take that alcohol to a Christmas party with 50 people in it, none of whom then are masked. The usual nonsensical stuff. I mean, that bit doesn't matter that much. I mean, wearing a mask in a supermarket, so what? But it doesn't make coherent sense. So what's the point of doing it? Everything I've seen so far agrees with what Joe Biden said this week, and it's not often you've heard that sentence coming out from me on any of these videos. This is something for concern, not for panic. We've just been trained to be jumpy about all this stuff. A little longer view and a cool head would be very helpful. All right, that's all I had to say for this. I will be interested to get your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to do all that cool stuff, liking this video, and if you've not already, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Thank you very much. See you for the news roundup on Friday. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.